Since the time of the Apostle Paul, the name Areopagus has often been used in Christian history to represent the intersection of Christian faith and culture. In first century Athens, the Areopagus functioned as a philosophical forum for the exchange of ideas, and it was there that Paul first brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to Europe. Today, the Areopagus is an Atlanta-based Christian education ministry and study center that offers seminars, workshops, and forums on topics relevant to contemporary Christian life and ministry. The mission of the Areopagus is to equip and educate Christians to effectively engage our society with the life-transforming truth and love of Jesus Christ. To this end, we offer substantive courses along with workshops and topical forums that challenge Christians to live faithfully and consistently in accord with the principles and practices of a holistic biblical worldview. Founded in 2003 by Dr. Jeffrey Beshears, the Areopagus sponsors dozens of events each year in venues throughout the metro Atlanta area. The Areopagus sponsors 3 regular programs in addition to other special events. The Areopagus Seminar Series features courses for Christians who want to broaden and deepen their understanding of the Christian faith and contemporary culture. These seminars are offered at a nominal cost and are taught by gifted instructors who are experts in their field, and include topics in biblical studies, Christian history, apologetics, contemporary cultural issues, contemplative spirituality, and literature and the arts. The Areopagus Forum Series features lectures, debates, and other presentations by outstanding Christian scholars, authors, and activists. Forums normally include a formal presentation and an extended question and answer session, and offer Christians a unique opportunity to interact with some of the great minds in contemporary Christianity. Forum topics include Christian apologetics, history, science, philosophy, and contemporary social and cultural issues, along with reviews and critiques of significant
Not sure why we lost the video there, but.
Okay. All right. Yes. Well, good evening and welcome to our Areopagus Forum this evening. We obviously just had a few technical difficulties with our introductory video, but glad you're joining us. And I want to say, first of all, thanks to Eric and Andrea Smith for setting up our Zoom meeting this evening. Also, our co-sponsor for the forum this evening is the Atlanta chapter of Reasons to Believe, RTB. So thanks to Rod Nave and the folks with RTB. Now, if you're not currently on our email contact list for the Areopagus and you'd like to know more about upcoming events and the ministry of the Areopagus in general, please let us know. Also, I would encourage you to check out our Areopagus Facebook page at www.facebook.com/theareopagus, and also our Watchman newsletter, which is compiled and edited by Millie Atkinson. This includes a lot of pertinent information on important issues and news, upcoming events, and other information that informed Christians need to know. Now, before we begin our session this evening, just a few Zoom protocols. Please be sure to keep your microphone on mute so we don't pick up any extraneous sounds or talking. And after our speaker's presentation this evening, we'll open up with Q&A and further discussion via chat. Since we're on a fairly tight schedule, please keep any questions and comments as brief and on point as possible. Also, as most of you know, the Areopagus sponsors in-depth semester-length seminars on many topics. Our course this semester is The Historical Quest for the Real Jesus. Are the gospel accounts of the life and teachings of Christ historically accurate? This course is being offered via Zoom, and if you'd like to join us, please contact us at the Areopagus. Now, over the last 17 years, the Areopagus has sponsored more than 300 seminars and forums on topics related to Christian apologetics, history, science, significant books and films, and contemporary cultural issues. And in the past, we've had presentations by people such as Charles Thaxton on intelligent design, the origins, the theory, and the controversy. Dr. Fazal Rana on who were Adam and Eve. Dr. Michael Sabom on science, the soul, and near-death experiences, a Christian analysis. Dr. Gary Moon on the life and legacy of Dallas Willard. Eric Smith on was the universe made for man, and if so, what is the evidence? Dr. Nancy Piercy on defining and defending sexual truth in a chaotic culture. Also Rod Dreher on how to be a Christian in a society that no longer is, based on his book, The Benedict Option, and my presentation on the history and philosophy of cultural Marxism and political correctness, based on my book, American Crisis, and of course, many other presentations as well. It is a real honor this evening to introduce our speaker for our session, Dr. John West. Dr. West is the Vice President and a Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute, where he also serves as Managing Director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture, which, by the way, he founded along with the philosopher of science, Stephen Meyer, back in 1996. Dr. West's current research examines the impact of science and scientism on public policy and culture, and among his other areas of expertise are religion and politics, American government and institutions, and constitutional law. Dr. West holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and a BA in communications from the University of Washington. Dr. West was previously an associate professor of political science at Seattle Pacific University, where he chaired the Department of Political Science, and he has taught political science and history courses at California State University, San Bernardino, and also at Azusa Pacific University. And he has written or edited 12 books, including The Politics of Revelation and Reason, Darwin Day in America, How Our Politics and Culture Have Been Dehumanized in the Name of Science, and The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism, and Society, which, by the way, we featured in an Areopagus forum back in the year 2012. Again, we had Dr. West join us virtually at that time. In addition, Dr. West has directed and written several documentaries, including the award-winning Biology of the Second Reich, Social Darwinism, and the Origins of World War I. Also, The War on Humans, which is a critique of the radical agenda to disparage the value of human beings in the name of saving planet Earth. He's also helped produce the popular YouTube series, Science Uprising. So the Areopagus, as I said, has sponsored events with Dr. West and with the Discovery Institute in the past, and it is certainly an honor to have him here with us this evening. Tonight, he'll be speaking on Darwin's 3 big ideas that impacted humanity. So please provide a very warm, howbeit virtual, welcome to our guest, Dr. John West.
Thank you. Thank you for such a gracious introduction. And it's really wonderful to be here virtually. It'd be even better if we were all in person. I think the last year has really, even for those of us who tend to be introspective introverts, have realized that a society where you can't actually connect with people in person is not the ideal. And so I have to admit, over the last months, I have never more looked forward to going to in-person church, which we are able to do now where I'm at, but and I know you are all too. But great work of the Areopagus also, because there aren't that many, there are too few Christians and others who really want to think through things and understand how the underlying ideas impact. As a man thinketh, as it says in Proverbs, so is he. And so when you find groups like that, they are jewels. And so certainly the Areopagus is a jewel, and wonderful name and its associations for what happened in Acts and how Paul brought the gospel to people in different cultures and drew on actually the insights of those cultures in his talk to them. So Jeffrey asked me a little bit just to tell you a little bit more about Discovery Institute, on a couple of my books. And so I'll just do that briefly and then launch into my talk. And let's see if this works. Okay. So Discovery Institute is a nonprofit education and research organization headquartered in Seattle. It was started back in 1991. We like to say we're a worldview think tank because we deal with underlying ideas that are impacting our culture, not just the immediate symptoms. Really, we have three main focal areas. One is science and technology, and we have most of our programs in that area and their impact on culture. Then economic freedom is really the second big area, and then what I call civic life is sort of the third area. Our foundational belief is that mind, not matter, is the source of creation and innovation, both in the natural world, it's the mind of God, if you will, and certainly in human achievement. It's also mind is the inspiration for innovation and creation. We are probably best known for our, as reference, our Center for Science and Culture, which was, again, as Jeffrey pointed out, was started in 1996 by Steve Meyer and myself. And it's sort of the hub for scientists and scholars who thinks there's evidence that nature is the product of intelligent design rather than accidental and unguided processes. So this year is our 25th anniversary, and really notable scientists and scholars who are involved with our Center for Science and Culture include biochemist Michael Behe, mathematicians David Berlinski and Bill Dembski, biologists Michael Denton, Jonathan Wells, Doug Axe, Gunter Beckley, chemist Marcos Eberlin from Brazil, biologist Ann Gager, geologist Casey Luskin, and many others. I'm hoping some of you may know some of those people. If not, I'd encourage you to get to know them. One of our newer programs is the Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence, founded by mathematician Bill Dembski and led by computer engineering professor Bob Marks at Baylor University, that looks at how human beings cannot be replaced by computers, how we're unique. And then we also have the Center on Human Exceptionalism, dealing with bioethics issues and technology, led by bioethicist and attorney Wesley J. Smith. And that looks into matters of things like euthanasia, infanticide, genetic engineering, and other challenges to human dignity and human uniqueness. And then finally, this isn't our final program, but just highlighting our main programs, we have a Center on Wealth and Poverty led by economist George Gilder, and that has a number of fellows. And in fact, I think I saw on the participants Gail Pooley, who's a professor of economics in Hawaii, who I think is joining us today. And he's also active in that Center on Wealth and Poverty that deals with economic freedom issues. As far as myself, Jeffrey gave you sort of a resume of what I've been involved in, and so I don't need to go over that again. He did ask me to say just a couple of words about two of my books. And so Darwin Day in America, which he mentioned, is really a history of the impact of Darwinism on society and culture in America over the past 150 years. And so on everything from crime to bioethics to economic policy. And some of what I'm going to say today is actually drawn from that book. And then The Magician's Twin, which he referenced, explores C.S. Lewis's warnings about the abuse of science in society and what Lewis called scientocracy, the effort to rule people in the name of science. And I actually think that Lewis's warnings have turned out to be exceptionally prophetic. And I mean, maybe during the Q&A we could say more about that. But finally, by way of introduction, if you don't know about Discovery Institute, or you end up being intrigued and I don't put you to sleep in my talk today, the talk is drawn from this basically 39-page monograph that I produced called Darwin's 3 Big Ideas, that you can get for absolutely free. So I have a free offer for you. If you go to discovery.org/big ideas, you can get it and download it. And that will contain a lot of the documentation for the various quotes and the other things I'm providing today. So with that, I will just sort of launch into Darwin's 3 Big Ideas that impacted humanity. And I'm going to start with this man. whose name is Peter Singer. And Peter Singer is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He's one of today's most notorious academic proponents of the devaluation of human life. For example, he writes that the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Now, his views are well known, at least among those who follow debates about the sanctity of human life. What's a lot less known is where he gets his ideas from. But a few years ago in an interview, he told us, and here's what he said: "All we are doing is catching up with Darwin. He showed that we are simply animals. Humans had imagined we were a separate part of creation, that there was some magical line between us and them. Darwin's theory undermined the foundations of that entire Western way of thinking about the place of our species in the universe." Now, I don't agree with Peter Singer on much, but I do happen to agree with him in this statement. I think Darwin's theory did do a lot to undermine the foundations of the Judeo-Christian view of human beings and their unique place in the universe. Darwin, of course, is best known for developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. According to that theory, all living things are related by common descent. That is, we're all ultimately descended with modifications from one simple ancestral organism. Darwin's theory further proposes that the evolution of life from single-celled organisms to you and I was driven primarily by natural selection, sometimes called survival of the fittest. According to modern Darwinian theory, it's randomly occurring mutations and recombinations in genes that produce variations among organisms in a population. Some of these random variations will help an organism survive and reproduce more effectively. And over time, these beneficial variations will come to dominate a population of organisms. And over even more time, these beneficial variations will accumulate, creating entirely new biological features and organisms. Now, apart from its contribution to science, Darwinian theory has fueled three big ideas in culture that have had, I think, significant consequences for our society's view of human life. Idea number one. First, Darwin's theory fueled the idea that humans aren't special. According to Darwinism, humans have the same origin as rats and fleas and toadstools, and we aren't fundamentally different from other animals. Darwin himself recognized that his theory diminished the case for human uniqueness, writing in one of his notebooks that it's absurd to talk about one animal being higher than another. He also complained elsewhere that people often talk of the wonderful event of intellectual man appearing, when in fact, and this is Darwin's own words, the appearance of insects with other senses is more wonderful. Okay? The appearance of insects is more wonderful than the appearance of man with mind. Darwinian biologists today relish emphasizing that humans are just another animal. So biologist Charles Zucker says that in essence, humans are nothing but a big fly. That's another direct quote. While geneticist Glenn Evans claims that, quote, the worm represents a very simple human, unquote. I would say very simple human. One science journalist writes that genetics shows that there isn't much difference between mice and men. And then the late Morris Goodman of Wayne State University liked to insist that we humans appear as only slightly remodeled chimpanzee-like apes. So in the Darwinian view, humans are not unique. We are not special. So that's really one of the big cardinal ideas gotten from Darwin's theory. A second big idea for culture that has been fueled by Darwinian theory is that humanity is the product of a blind, unguided process. As Darwin himself made clear, natural selection is an unintelligent process that's blind to the future. In Darwin's own words, quote, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows, unquote. Natural selection can't select new features based on some future goal. It only favors traits that are beneficial to survive right now. So as a result, evolution by natural selection is, and now I'm quoting 38 Nobel laureates from a statement in 2005, that natural selection is the result of an unguided, unplanned process, in the words of these Nobel laureates. So according to Darwinism, amazing biological features like the human eye, the wings of butterflies, the blood clotting system are in no way the purposeful result of evolution. Rather, they're the unintended byproducts of chance and necessity. The same holds true for higher animals such as human beings. In the words of the late Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, man is the result of a purposeless process, a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. So in the Darwinian worldview, you and I are accidents of natural history, not the purposeful creations of a loving creator. So the third big idea fueled by Darwin's theory is that the great engine of progress in the history of life has been mass death. Instead of believing that the remarkable features of humans and other living things reflect the intelligent design of a master artist, Darwin portrayed death and destruction as our ultimate creator. And if you really think about that and let that sort of get through your mind and heart, you will begin to realize just how disturbing that is, to make all the good things that ever existed be the product basically of mass death, not of a loving creator. As Darwin wrote at the end of his most famous work on the origin of species, thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, which he would include us in, directly follows. So mass death is our creator. Now, I'd say ideas have consequences, as Richard Weaver wrote, and for more than 150 years, these three Darwinian ideas have shaped social beliefs and actions in virtually every sphere of our lives, including race relations, medicine, environmentalism, criminal justice, ethics, and religion. And in our brief time together tonight, I want to touch about some of these areas, and then we certainly can discuss more in Q&A. But the first area is Darwinian racism. Now, Charles Darwin was not the world's first racist. Many of his critics were racist, and he was better than some racists in that he opposed slavery. Nevertheless, Darwin's theory exerted a powerful influence on the development and growth of a virulent form of scientific, or at least claimed to be scientific racism. As Harvard evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote and acknowledged, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859 when Darwin published his book on the origin of species, but they increased by orders of magnitude. Biological arguments for racism increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. That was the view of evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. Now, why was this? Well, Darwin believed that his theory of natural selection provided a scientific explanation for why races should have unequal capacities and why there should be higher and lower races. And just in brief, to try to understand why he thought that and why this is sort of part of the logic of his theory. In Darwin's theory, the specific traits an animal needs to survive differ based on the animal's environment. Thus, there's no reason to expect that natural selection acting on different populations will produce the same traits in every population, or in this case, every race, because they're acted on, every different subpopulation is acted on by its particular environment. And so it may have different environmental needs. And so natural selection will act differently on different populations. That's why Darwinists expected to find differences in the capacities of different races. And accordingly, Darwin, in his book, The Descent of Man, declared that there are significant differences in the mental faculties of what he called men of distinct races. He also argued that the break in evolutionary history between apes and humans came between, and I'm using his words here, the Negro or Australian, by which he meant Australian Aborigine, and the gorilla. Thus, he was depicting blacks as the closest human beings to apes in that passage. Darwin's supporters further popularized these ideas. There was a German scientist named Ernst Haeckel, who was one of Darwin's correspondents and one of the most celebrated champions of Darwin's theory in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Haeckel created this widely disseminated diagram of human evolution that portrayed the evolutionary gap between the highest human and the lowest human as larger than the gap between the lowest human and the highest ape-like creature, which was just happened to be given features of an African. And just to, if it's not clear, let me see, I think I can show you here. So this is supposed to be, this guy is supposed to be the cream of the crop, tip of the top, the Aryan head, the most advanced part of the human race. And then this is supposed to be sort of the lowest human who has African features. And note that the gap between these different humans is larger than the gap between the lowest human and the highest ape-like creature. And that was Haeckel's point. And it was echoed by many Darwinian scientists by the era. Now, the idea that non-white races represented a throwback to lower stages of evolution was also widely embraced throughout the scientific community in the early 20th century. And consider the views of this man who you're seeing right now. That's Charles Davenport. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences and regarded as one of the founding fathers of the field of genetics. Davenport was obsessed with the idea that some races were still stuck in lower evolutionary stages, particularly Black races. Now, Darwinian racism plays a role in the justification of a lot of things, including one of the first genocides, and maybe the first genocide of the 20th century. In the early 1900s, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero and Nama peoples in Southwest Africa, modern Namibia. And I have a video clip, we'll see if it works, that from my documentary, The Biology of the Second Reich, that really talks about this. It's just a brief clip, but let's see if it works.
Between 1904 and 1908, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero people in Southwest Africa in what some scholars consider the first genocide of the 20th century. On October the 2nd, 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as his extermination order, declaring that the Hereros either had to leave German Southwest Africa or face extinction. Herero men would be executed, and Herero women and children would be driven into the desert where they would die of starvation or dehydration. Von Trotha justified his extermination campaign by an explicit appeal to social Darwinism, telling one newspaper that human feelings of philanthropy could not override the law of Darwin's the struggle of the fittest. When von Trotha's extermination campaign provoked a backlash in Germany, a new plan was developed to move the remaining Hereros to concentration camps, where many more would ultimately die from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. In these death camps, the Hereros were subjected to medical experiments by German doctors, and their skulls were collected for shipment back to Germany to be studied by experts in racial science. By 1908, it's estimated that more than 80% of the Herero people had been eliminated from German Southwest Africa. Back in Europe, meanwhile, German military leaders prepared for the next conflict on their continent.
So again, that was before World War I. So this was not World War II. These were not the Nazis. These were Germans, social Darwinist Germans in the early 1900s, in the first few years of the century. And as the quote put it, the German general justified the eradication in terms of Darwin's theory of sort of survival, or the struggle for survival of the fittest. Well, what was happening in the United States at the same time? Well, in 1904, we had the St. Louis World's Fair in what has been known now by scholars. They call it one of the world's largest human zoos. That is, they displayed native peoples at the fair as representing lower stages of human evolution. And I have another clip here from my documentary, Human Zoos, that is done in newsreel style. It's not an actual newsreel, but we presented it that way dramatically. But the words are actually verbatim from a newspaper article of the time that talks about the display of pygmies from Africa. And I want you to note, again, these are the actual words of the newspaper article that are used, even though it's sort of recreated dramatically as a newsreel. I want you to think about how they're using Darwin's theory to really dehumanize people. And this was in the United States in 1904.
Or the simian type. It is believed that the pygmies, who are said to represent the lowest form of human development, are next removed from the simian family.
So very clearly describing African pygmies as the lowest, and just a step up from the apes, and that was quite common at the time of what scientists were saying. Then we have just 2 years later, in 1906, in the Bronx Zoo in New York City, they actually displayed a man from Africa, Otobenga, in a cage with a monkey as an evolutionary missing link between humans and apes. And that's also covered in my documentary, available for free on YouTube, Human Zoos. And here's just about a 1-minute clip that describes what happened there.
On display in the Monkey House on Saturday, September the 8th, 1906. The next day, a sign was placed on the cage explaining the new exhibit.
The African pygmy, Otobenga, age 23 years, height 4 feet 11 inches, weight 103 pounds, brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, exhibited each afternoon during September.
Thousands of New Yorkers came to stare and laugh and debate the meaning of the display. Is it a man? Some of them wondered. Newspaper coverage brought even more people, and in just a few weeks, the zoo drew nearly 250,000 visitors.
Okay. There's a lot more to that story that we can't talk about, but I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to, it's also a story of how some Christian ministers stood up for the humanity of Otobenga, both Black ministers and white ministers. And whereas secular outlets like the New York Times were saying, what's the big deal? And they didn't see any problem with exhibiting this man in a cage with apes. But the Christian ministers did at the time. A lot of things we can learn from that. But let's just go on. So by the 1920s in America, new immigration restrictions had been imposed in cooperation with Darwinian biologists who had decided that certain races were lower on the evolutionary scale, and so they needed to be kept out. Fortunately, since the civil rights movement, most scientists have abandoned Darwinian racism, but there are some exceptions. This man in 2007 got into trouble. He's Nobel Prize-winning biologist James Watson, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. He sparked an uproar by suggesting that Blacks are biologically inferior to whites. Watson further suggested, why was he arguing this? And this is the part that didn't get covered as much in the media. But if you go back to his interviews, his argument for Black inferiority was based on the idea that human evolution operates differently on different populations. This is, and so you should expect these, really significant racial differences. And so he grounded his argument for Black inferiority based on Darwinian evolution. That part of his views didn't really get out into the media much. They just focused on that he was a racist, not explaining where he got it from. Outside the scientific community, we have white supremacists, and I don't think there are, fortunately, I think these are fringe groups here, but they do exist in the so-called alt-right that are unfortunately attempting to resurrect Darwinian arguments for racism that have now been rejected by the scientific community. And so my documentary also does get into some of that. Okay. So we've talked about Darwinian racism. Let's go on to talk about Darwinian eugenics and the impact of Darwinism on the field of medicine. So, like I said, Darwinism's perhaps most far-reaching impact on medicine was this idea of eugenics, which was described by its proponents as the self-direction of human evolution. The inspiration for eugenics sprang directly from Darwin's theory. In Darwin's view, the key reason humans developed their outstanding capabilities, again, was not because they were designed that way by a creator, but because natural selection ruthlessly weeded out the unfit. The problem, according to eugenists, was that in the name of humanitarianism, particularly Christian humanitarianism, civilized societies were now doing their best to care for those who nature would have killed off. And the eugenists, the Darwinian eugenists, thought that this humanitarianism would lead to disaster. And so Darwin himself, in his book, The Descent of Man, which is a book too little read, Darwin criticized modern society for methodically undermining natural selection's process of elimination by helping the mentally ill, helping the handicapped, creating hospitals for the sick, welfare programs for the poor. Darwin even warned about the dangers of vaccinating people against smallpox because he thought vaccination would preserve thousands, this is quoting him, who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed. And so his stark conclusion is this, and now I'm quoting him directly. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Now, Darwin was a kindly man, so he was torn by the implications of his theory, and he thought that human sympathy wouldn't allow people to follow his theory to its logical conclusion. Likewise, many of his followers believed it would be too cruel for humans just to go back to the old law of the jungle. They wanted to develop a kinder, gentler way to mimic the effects of natural selection through modern science. That became the rationale for eugenics. Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is generally recognized as the official founder of eugenics, and he actually coined the term. Positive eugenics focused on encouraging those deemed the most biologically fit to reproduce more, while negative eugenics focused on curtailing reproduction by those deemed biologically unfit, including mentally handicapped and criminals and people of lower races. And I mean, you name it, they had a lot of lists of people who they thought we should curtail the reproduction from. Eugenics, it's important to say, became the consensus view of the scientific community. It wasn't just on the fringes, it was the consensus view. It was promoted by leading evolutionary biologists and others and scientists around the world. In America, eugenics supporters included biologists at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, University of Georgia, the National Academy of Sciences, all over. Today, the Darwinian roots of eugenics tends to be downplayed, but the Darwinian rationale for eugenics was explicit in the writings of eugenists themselves. For example, we have Harvard geneticist Edward East, who insisted that eugenic tenets are strict corollaries of the theory of organic evolution. That was his own words. Or we have Princeton biologist Edwin Conklin, you see him there on the cover of Time magazine, advocating for eugenics as a way to undo modern society's violation of natural selection, the great law of evolution and progress. Those are his words again. The impact of eugenics on American public policy was far-ranging, including laws who could marry, who could immigrate here, immigration restrictions on races considered lower on the evolutionary scale, which included strains, not just sort of blacks or Hispanics, but also my grandparents came from Eastern Europe, and they were regarded, the Slavic communities were regarded as lower on the evolutionary scale, and so they tried to keep them out. And then there was forced sterilization for those considered less fit in Darwinian terms. In America, we had 60,000 women at least, it was actually more than that, who were sterilized against their will in the name of eugenics. That was mild compared to the impact of Darwinian eugenics in some other places. Germany's eugenics movement sterilized hundreds of thousands of people and murdered 300,000 disabled children and adults, many in gas chambers dressed up as shower stalls. It was during these eugenic killings of the handicapped that the Nazis developed some of the methods they used later to murder millions of Jews. Most people don't recognize that before they killed the Jews, they killed the handicapped, and that things like the horrific use of gas chambers dressed up as shower stalls was first used on handicapped children in behalf of Darwinian eugenics. Now, after the general public learned about the atrocities committed in the name of eugenics in Nazi Germany, Darwinian eugenics was widely discredited, thankfully. But Darwinism continued to influence bioethics debates in other ways. And so let's bring to some more recent things. Scientists and political activists alike have appealed to Darwinian theory to justify abortion, for example, by claiming that babies in the womb are not fully human, invoking an idea known as embryonic recapitulation. These proponents of abortion have argued that human infants replay the history of evolution as they develop in the womb. They go through we're supposed to go through a fish stage, a lower mammal stage, and more before human infants finally reach the state of a human being. Thus, if you abort an infant while she is still in the fish stage, it's no more immoral than killing a fish. These are actual arguments people have made since the 1960s. Actually, the arguments themselves go back to Ernst Haeckel and even before, but in America, certainly they were made in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even today. Embryonic recapitulation is junk science and has been discredited even among evolutionary biologists for decades. That has not stopped this argument from being invoked repeatedly in public as a justification for abortion in America. In the 1980s, for example, this argument was cited approvingly by this guy, University of Michigan geneticist James Neal. Neal was a member of the elite National Academy of Sciences and one of America's top geneticists. So he wasn't just a non-scientist who was making this argument. He was making it not in the 1890s, but in the 1980s. More recently still, the late journalist Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, similarly defended abortion by claiming that in utero, we see a microcosm of nature and evolution itself. We begin as tiny forms that are amphibian. Well, not really, but that was his argument for abortion. And then even more recently, in the 2000s, we have Planned Parenthood official Alexander Sanger. Yes, he is related to Margaret Sanger. He's her grandson. He argues that human-directed abortion is a product of natural selection. How so? These are his words. Humanity has evolved to take conscious control of reproduction and has done so in order to survive. We cannot repeal the laws of natural selection. Nature does not let every life survive. Humanity, uniquely and to its benefit, can exercise some dominion over this process and maximize the chances for human life to survive and grow. Well, maximize the chances for some human lives to survive and grow by killing off others. In any case, that is his argument. Darwinism has even fed into debates over infanticide. This man is University of Chicago evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, one of our top evolutionary biologists today. He has argued on his blog for legalizing infanticide for babies with biological defects. As he wrote, after all, we euthanize our dogs and cats when to prolong their lives would be torture, so why not extend that to humans? Why not extend that to humans? Well, he recognizes that the reason we don't do so is because of a view of human beings that Darwinism has yet to completely overcome. And now I'm quoting directly from Jerry Coyne again. Quote, the reason we don't allow euthanasia of human newborns is because humans are seen as special. And I think this comes from religion, in particular, the view that humans, unlike animals, are endowed with a soul. When religion vanishes, as it will, so will much of the opposition to both adult and newborn euthanasia. Okay. So a similar Darwinian devaluation of life can be seen today among what I would call radical environmentalists. I'm not talking about people who want to treat the planet well or treat humans well, treat nature well. I think that's part of environmental stewardship, and that's very well worthy of what we should do as humans. But there is a sort of a virulent strain of sort of virulently anti-human environmentalists who are motivated largely by a Darwinian worldview. In the book and film, The War on Humans, by my colleague Wesley J. Smith, he has documented how the growing coercive utopianism of some environmentalists and how it's grounded in this visceral hatred of humans and the denial of human beings as being special or unique. To give an example, in the words of this man, who's University of Texas evolutionary zoologist Eric Pianka. Pianka argues humans are no better than bacteria. These are quotes from him. And other things on this earth have been here longer than us, and they have a right to this planet too. That includes wasps that sting you, ants that bite you, scorpions, and rattlesnakes. Pianka goes on to criticize humans for sucking everything we can out of Mother Earth and turning it into fat human biomass. He then urges the reduction of the Earth's human population by up to 90%. And calls on the government to confiscate all the earnings of any couple who has more than 2 children. I'm not kidding you. Now, here's a direct quote. Here's what he says. You should have to pay more when you have your first kid. You pay more taxes. When you have your second kid, you pay a lot more taxes. And when you have your third kid, you don't get anything back. They take it all. Now, underlying the radical environmentalist hatred for humans is the Darwinian rejection of human uniqueness. So you see this in Christopher Maines. He wrote a book a few years ago called Green Rage. He was one of the early leaders of a group called Earth First. And here's what he said in that book. Darwin invited humanity to face the fact that the observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence that humankind is superior or special, or even particularly more interesting than, say, lichen, a moss-like plant. There's not one observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence that we are superior or special to moss. Say, well, you can think whether he's viewing the same reality that you are or not. But let's take it where this goes to when people are sort of mentally unhinged. You get someone like eco-terrorist James Lee, who in 2010 took staff of the Discovery cable channel hostage. And what motivated him? In an online manifesto, he told us, here's what he said in his online manifesto: talk about evolution, talk about Malthus and Darwin until it sinks into the stupid people's brains and they get it. Saving the planet means saving what's left of the non-human wildlife by decreasing the human population. That means stopping the human race from breeding any more disgusting human babies. Okay. Darwin's theory has also exerted a corrosive influence on morality and human accountability. In a Darwinian view, morality is reduced to pre-programmed behavior in service of physical survival. So in the words of Darwinian philosopher Michael Ruse and Harvard evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. As a result, human free will is non-existent, to cite the words of late Cornell University professor Bill Provine. With this worldview, as you could expect, attacks on personal responsibilities have often featured prominently in Darwinian accounts of human behavior during the past century and a half. For example, Darwinism played a key role in the development of what was called the New School of Criminal Anthropology, led and founded by Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso and others in the late 19th century. These criminologists tried to find Darwinian explanations for why people engaged in crime, even labeling some persons born criminals because they were supposed to be throwbacks to an earlier stage in evolutionary history. But the diminishment of free will and personal responsibility is not the only way Darwinism has impacted morality. Darwinism has also provided a robust biological justification for moral relativism. According to Darwin, specific moral precepts develop because under certain environmental conditions, they promote survival. But once those conditions for survival change, so too do the dictates of morality. That's why we find in nature both the maternal instinct and infanticide, both honoring your parents and killing them when they become feeble. Natural selection chooses whatever behavioral traits best promote survival under existing circumstances. So a Darwinian understanding of morality makes it very difficult to condemn as evil any human behavior that has persisted, because every trait that continues to exist, even among a subpopulation, has an equal right to claim nature's sanction. Presumably, even antisocial behaviors such as fraud and pedophilia and rape must continue to exist among human beings because they were favored at some point by natural selection and therefore have some sort of biological basis. Of course, you could still justly condemn those behaviors if there existed a permanent moral standard independent of natural selection, but the existence of such a standard is precisely what orthodox Darwinism denies. Now, for the most part, Darwin himself didn't press his relativistic analysis of morality to its logical conclusion, although in some of his private notebooks, he did sort of approach some of these issues, but publicly he was more circumspect. But certainly he laid the groundwork for others who came after him, and his ideas helped reshape how people think about morality. Nowhere has this Darwinian view of ethics had a severer impact than in family life and human sexuality. The thinker perhaps most responsible for the breakdown of traditional sexual ethics in Western culture was a Harvard-trained evolutionary zoologist. Most of you probably know his name, but you don't know that he was an evolutionary zoologist. That was his training. His name is Alfred Kinsey. Adopting a thoroughly Darwinian approach to sexual morality, he argued that any sexual practice that could be found somewhere among other mammals because it was found among other mammals, could be regarded as normal mammalian behavior and thus be regarded as unobjectionable. It was a very Darwinian way of arguing. So today, we have many evolutionary psychologists have gone beyond mere sexual relativism and are affirmatively arguing against monogamy. They claim that we were bred by Darwinian evolution to have multiple sex partners, which means that we are programmed, pre-programmed, if you will, for promiscuity and infidelity. In their view, the very idea of faithful monogamous marriage contradicts our biology and must therefore be abandoned. One prominent evolutionary psychologist to advocate this view is Christopher Ryan, co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Sex at Dawn. In the words of Ryan, marriage in the West isn't doing very well because it's in direct confrontation with the evolved reality of our species. Ryan says he wants to save marriage by making it consistent with Darwinian biology. For him, that means we should redefine marriage to include multiple partners at the same time. As long as you redefine marriage to mean as many partners as you want, then that will save marriage. Well, some of us might disagree that if you might be redefining marriage out of existence, but that's the argument that he makes. Okay, let's get to my final area and then as we wrap up. So a final profound impact of Darwin's theory has been in the area of religion, where Darwinism has supplied a potent scientific rationale for atheism. Now, Darwinism doesn't logically necessitate atheism, in my view, but it certainly does, is sympathetic to it, or I would say even encourages it. If you think about it, if nature really supplies proof that the history of life is the product of an unguided process, then that would seem to make an atheist worldview much more credible. I think that's why so many scientists have made unguided Darwinian evolution a cornerstone in their cases for atheism. And a lot of you will know about these people, so we don't need to go over them. But of course, former Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins, who's famous for saying Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He's one of the scientists who uses Darwinism as a cornerstone for his argument for atheism. Harvard's E.O. Wilson does something similar. He says the existence of a God who directs organic evolution and intervenes in human affairs is increasingly contravened by biology and the brain sciences. And then we have David Barish, who's a psychologist, evolutionary psychologist at the University of Washington, where I actually, as an undergraduate, I actually debated him on a radio show as a young undergraduate on some of his beliefs about various things, not his beliefs on Darwinism. It was an interesting experience. But he said this in the New York Times just a few years ago: the more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. So in a nationwide survey of American atheists and agnostics that Discovery Institute conducted in 2016, nearly 7 in 10 atheists in America and more than 4 in 10 self-identified agnostics say that unguided chemical evolution and Darwin's mutation natural selection mechanism have made the existence of God less likely for them personally. So this isn't just a few academics that this influences. This is a lot of people that this Darwinian story has impacted in their personal beliefs about whether God exists. Similarly, basically more than 70% of atheists argue that they agreed with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins when he wrote that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at no bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But I want to make a point that Darwin's impact on religion hasn't just been limited to atheists and agnostics. It's also reshaped how many Christians and other theists view God, especially at Christian colleges and universities, where scientists and theologians have tried to revise Christianity to make it compatible with Darwinism. Because Darwinian evolution is by nature unguided, theistic Darwinists often downplay or reject the idea that God actively directs the development of life. And so we have Anglican priest and physicist John Polkinghorne, who just recently died, arguing that an evolutionary universe is theologically understood as a creation allowed to make itself. Think about that for a moment. Creation allowed to make itself. That's not exactly the picture that you get, I would argue, in the biblical tradition or in the Christian philosophical theological tradition. But this is an effort to try to meld things, to revise Christianity to make it acceptable to unguided Darwinism. We have Roman Catholic biologist Ken Miller from Brown University, who argues that mankind's appearance on this planet was not preordained. We are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out. Again, evolution is so unpredictable that God himself doesn't really know specifically how it's going to turn out, which is a common belief among people who argue for theistic Darwinism. We have former Vatican astronomer George Coyne, who argued during his lifetime, not even God could know with certainty that human life would come to be, because evolution is an unpredictable process even to God, an unguided process. Not even God knows how it will turn out. Or we can talk about former Christian physicist Carl Giberson, although formerly taught in an evangelical Christian university, who argued that against and reputed other biblical doctrines, like the doctrine of a historic fall, the idea that human beings were originally created good and then fell into sin through a voluntary act of disobedience, which is sort of standard Christian theology for the past 2,000 years. According to Carl Giberson, in this book endorsed by Francis Collins, since human beings were created through Darwinian evolution, they were essentially evil and sinful and bad to start with, because selfishness drives the evolutionary process. So there was really no fall. Human beings were not originally created morally innocent. Still, other theistic Darwinists challenge the idea that God's handiwork in nature is observable, especially in biology. And that's where we get Christian geneticist Francis Collins, who suggests that evolution could appear to us to be driven by chance, while from God's perspective, the outcome could be specified. So he's trying, basically, in his words, God makes the history of life look random and undirected, even though it really is not. So, I mean, I'd say that's a little bit better than the idea of that things really are random and undirected and that God himself doesn't know how things are going to turn out. Collins suggests, well, maybe God did know how things are going to turn out, but he just made things look like they're random and undirected. I will say Collins' view flies in the face of thousands of years of both Jewish and Christian thinkers who believed otherwise, maintaining that God's purposeful actions and design could be clearly seen throughout nature. So as I conclude, Daniel Dennett, a Darwinian philosopher of science, has aptly described Darwinism as a universal acid that dissolves traditional ideas about morality, human responsibility, and God. And I'd say, without question, Darwinian theory has exerted a revolutionary impact on human society. Ironically, though, Darwinism's cultural cachet and prestige has continued to expand even while its scientific basis has sharply diminished in the face of withering critiques in recent years. And that's not the topic of my talk, but I'll just give you one example of the growing recognition among many scientists that Darwinism really has some problems. So this is from Robert Laughlin, a Nobel laureate physicist at Stanford, who I don't know his views. I don't know whether he's a theist. I don't know his views on a lot of other things, but he wrote a book a few years ago where he said this: evolution by natural selection has lately come to function more as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and legitimize findings that are at best questionable and at worst not even wrong. I'd say if Laughlin and many others, including my colleagues at Discovery Institute, are right, it may be a good time to fundamentally challenge Darwinism's continuing hegemony on culture, because certainly it's the scientific case for Darwinism is not very solid anymore. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time. Look forward to Q&A, and want to again just let's say that if I didn't put you to sleep and you're interested in this, you can get a 39-page digital download that sort of summarizes what I've been talking here, but gives more detail and also gives the references and footnotes. And so with that, I'm going to go back and you can see me, and I'm done and ready for Q&A, but I'll leave it to Jeffrey to tell how we're going to handle that.
John, thank you very much. Extremely informative. And when John first made his monograph available, Darwin's 3 Big Ideas That Impacted Humanity, I immediately downloaded it and read it. I've read it a couple of times since. It's not very long, but it is just absolutely packed with very, very essential, important information that I think all informed Christians would want to be familiar with. So thank you very much for writing that and for your excellent presentation. We have about 30 minutes in which we can entertain very brief comments and questions. We'll try to get in as many as possible. Let me begin by looking here at the chats that have come in. The first one, are you going to post this recording on your website later on the Areopagus website? And yes, we will. Okay. In fact, Andrea Smith had responded to that. How long before this presentation will appear? And Andrea or Eric, could you address that?
It will take a couple days to get it up on our website. The question there about YouTube, social media, and mainstream journalists, I'm not sure that we have the ability to get a Zoom recording up to YouTube.
Okay.
I will encourage people, if you're interested in things, you could go to the Discovery Institute Science channel, Discovery Institute Science at YouTube, and you will find, I do have a talk. It's shorter than the one that I just gave, but that encapsulates some of the things from 2020. I think it may be called Darwin's Corrosive Ideas. So you could refer people to that. Certainly, I referenced some of the documentaries, like Human Zoos now has more than 3 million views on YouTube. And so you can even dig down. So there's a lot of content that I talked about here that you can actually find in various ways on Discovery Institute's YouTube channel.
Okay. Eric Smith asks, nowadays, Darwinists will call eugenics an illegitimate abuse of Darwinian theory, even though it seems like a natural conclusion. What are their arguments to support this claim?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Eric. That's an excellent question. In most cases, they don't really make a serious argument. It's just they're wanting to avoid it. When they do make an argument, the only argument I've seen has been they point out that so natural selection is natural selection, and so it's not human-directed evolution, and so that eugenics was human-directed evolution, and so that's not what Darwinism is about. And so that's when they say it's an illegitimate extrapolation. Except that isn't much of a justification either, because if I try to get into this a little bit there, but I'll just reemphasize it. The Darwinists who argued for eugenics all said, and I cite in my book Darwin Day in America, yes, a more pristine Darwinism would be good to go back to the law of the jungle, and we shouldn't be helping these people. We shouldn't have eugenics. We should stop helping the mentally ill, stop vaccination. We should do all that. But we're kinder and gentler, and Darwin himself was sympathetic, and so we don't want to go back just to the cruel law of the jungle. So while they're right to say that eugenics wasn't a direct application of Darwinism, that's because it was the kinder, gentler approach. The true application of Darwinism was even worse. And the Darwinists thought they were being kind by doing what they did. And so but as far as, the connection is pretty blatant. I mean, people can say, was it logically necessitated or not? All the leading evolutionary scientists from the late 19th century through certainly before World War II, many of them were eugenists, and they argued on Darwinian reasons. I mean, eugenics itself was founded by Charles Darwin's cousin. And so it's a pretty close connection. And like I said, the only argument I've seen I mean, usually it's just they want to run away from it. So they say it was illegitimate and they don't explain it. But when they do, the few times they explain it, it's that, well, natural selection is natural. It's not government imposed or it's not doctor imposed. That's true. But again, they understood that. They thought they were being the kinder, gentler version.
John, here's a question from Bruce Phillips, who is one of our science experts with the Areopagus. And Bruce makes the comment that after your distressing information, very necessary information, but distressing, we need, he says, the counterbalance of the idea of the return of the God hypothesis. And I believe Bruce is mostly finished reading Stephen Meyer's new book.
Wow, that's an accomplishment. Yeah. I would agree. I would agree with that. That's a great idea. And I will say, you know, my talk here focused more on just the negative was on that. But if you watch my talk from the 2020 Dallas Science and Faith Conference, I actually end talking about some of the positive views of people like Steve Meyer and actually of Michael Denton and some others. And so I do agree with that. This is not the be all end all. It's actually helps to point people to the positive. And so I fully agree with that. I didn't do that in this talk. I have done that in some others. And certainly you'll find a lot of that also on Discovery's YouTube channel.
And Margarita writes, thank you. I think this can help inform discernment of our responsibility related to Micah 6:8, and that is to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Craig writes, but that response from Darwinists,
send in our questions.
Yes.
but that response from Darwinists seems to beg the question, if humans are the product of, quote, nature, how are our choices not a part of natural selection?
Oh, that's right. That's exactly right. But how shall I put it? Very few Darwinian biologists are philosophers or logicians, and they just don't deal with that issue. But you're right. I mean, because humans, I mean, they'll sometimes sort of make the argument that, well, humans have advanced so far, we're now counteracting natural selection. But how does that make sense in the Darwinian terms? It doesn't really. And why should you even be concerned? I mean, whoever wins out is just who wins out. Darwin's theory basically is a theory of whatever is. And morality comes about through reasons of survival value too. And so if you have some other transcendent standard, yes, you can still justify it, but Darwin doesn't have a way of dealing with that. So you're right. There are all sorts of internal contradictions with Darwin and trying to apply his theory to society. But most of the Darwinists sort of don't recognize that.
Nalani Hilderman writes, Dr. West, do you see any connection between Darwinian racism and critical race theory?
Yeah, I'm probably going to punt on that question because I'm not, you know, I've done some reading on critical race theory and understand some of the origins in Marxism and things. And actually, Jeffrey, you're probably better in dealing with this question than I am. So I think I'm going to punt on that. I will say the obsession with human beings as in distinct races and groupings that did feed into ideas like critical race theory and Marxism and lots of other things, certainly was influenced by Darwinism, because that obsession with, you know, that racial and group differences are the most fundamental thing, and trying to emphasize that in biological terms certainly did have an influence. But other than that, I don't think I'm competent to say anymore.
Very deep issue, I would think. Yes, thanks for your response to that. That, as you say, that would require a considerable amount of thought, a very deep question. Now, this comes from Gwyneth Shotwell. This sounds like a question like I would ask, and that is, can you possibly comment on the role of Marx's reliance on Darwin to make his theories scientific? The connection between Marx and Darwin.
There certainly is a connection between Darwinism and Marxism, Leninism, Marx and Engels. Marx did read Darwin. Now, Marx, like most Germans, were snooty when it came to English people. So he sort of said, Darwin in his crude English style, in one of his letters, Darwin in his crude English style on the Origin of Species provided the basis in natural history for our view. So I'd say, just to summarize it, is the Marxists took two things from Darwin's theory. One was a scientific justification for materialism, for why God doesn't exist, why we're just material things. And so they took that and all up and down the line, all Marxists, appreciate Darwin for that. But the second thing is as a description of why capitalism was bad and how because they viewed, the class struggle as basically Darwinian biological struggle applied to the social world. Mm-hmm. So they did, and in their view, Darwin provided the analysis for what was wrong with the world, and so why we need the dictatorship of the proletariat to bring about, nirvana, a worker's paradise against it. So they thought Darwin, number one, showed what the world really is, that it was a godless world that's just, run by material entities. But then two, it showed that it's a dog-eat-dog world. That's how we got where we are. And we want to get beyond that. So as I think Marx said, one of his most famous sort of essays where he said, my goal isn't just to explain the world. It's basically to, change the world. And so Darwin provides the indictment of our current human society being basically based on struggle for survival that he hopes the Marxist utopia is going to supplant.
I don't know why he wouldn't just go ahead and advocate that the survival of the fittest in a free and open society that's hyper competitive.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just there were some. So like, there's Marx. There were other socialists. So in American, there was Jack London, most known for Call of the Wild. He was a social Darwinist socialist, and he actually made the argument that the workers taking control of things through socialism was an example of survival of the fittest by the workers, taking control of things, and so that they were winning by doing that. And so although he was one of the socialists who realized, so what happens if you get to the socialist paradise where everyone is provided for and you have no, I don't want to say struggle, but desire for people to be the best or to, to encourage people to, be their best and things. And he was afraid that once you got to the socialist utopia, then it retrogrades because no one has a reason to do anything or to excel. And so he was actually concerned by that. And that's why many Marxists or socialists ended up being strong supporters of eugenics, because in Jack London thought, yes, the old law of survival of the fittest, that's bad, that's cruel. We get the Marxist utopia where everyone's provided for. But then the problem is we're just going to stagnate and we're going to retrograde. And so we need something, as he said, a new law of development or a new law of evolution. If we get rid of Darwin's survival of the fittest, we've got to create something like eugenics or else we'll destroy our race. So that was an argument the socialists made for eugenics.
Oh my.
We have a number of comments in the chat over here, and I just wanted to let you know that everybody can read the chat if you want to take a look at them. And we're looking to see if there's any more questions that we can ask John West, and if you could keep them short so that we can give him the time to talk. Thanks.
Okay. Paul Atkinson says, I noticed that many of these ideas, including the low view of the value of human life and elevation of animals over humans, are ones that I associate with the political left. At the same time, these Darwinists are downplaying human responsibility. So when leftists attack me as a white male in their critical race theory viewpoint, I may simply claim I am exonerated because of natural selection.
Yeah, I think that a lot of our modern discussion is, they used to say that philosophy was a series of footnotes to Plato. I'd say sort of modern thought is a series of footnotes to Nietzsche. And, if you have the bleak Darwinian view of the world, all you have left is creating your own. It's a struggle for power, to impose your own will on reality. And so that is a lot of the current conversation. I will say here, a lot of these ideas are influential on the left, but there are a fair number of people on the right in conservative institutions that are pretty much have bought into many of these things. One really explicit example, he's no longer at National Review, but he was for years, one of the strongest opponents of the idea of intelligent design in nature and of Christians and of theists was for many years at National Review. He was their signature person, John Derbyshire. And he was loved by the current, and a protege of the current editor of National Review, I mean, this is sort of post William F. Buckley. And John Derbyshire is an out and out Darwinian racist who thinks that humans are not exceptional because we're just another branch on nature's family tree. And I left out my quote. Usually, sometimes I actually give quotes from him in it to sort of I give you Peter Singer's view and then John Derbyshire's view. And so some on the secular right are very much endeared of some of the Darwinian ideas, and some of the so-called, and I know the alt-right, I say so-called because that term has been so abused, but there is, if you actually go back to the core people who actually embrace the term alt-right, there is a lot of Darwinian racism in that group. It's a small group, but it is, as I'm not talking about everyone the media calls alt-right. The media calls anyone they don't like alt-right. But I'm talking about the people who actually do argue it. If you read their things, as I have, and there are some studies of their beliefs where they actually talk about thinking other races are lesser evolved than whites. I mean, so there is a hardcore secular right that does draw on these things just as much as the left. I think it's a much smaller group on the right than it is on the left.
Father Giles writes, the continuing resistance to your work and that of scientists who join with the Discovery Institute can be in part explained that human beings are reluctant to let go of the permissiveness which has been engendered by Darwinism and which has become embedded in our culture and which to some degree infects us all. Would you want to comment on that?
I think that's very perceptive. And I think, for some people, it's not explicit, but for some people it is. And I do think if Darwin's account of unguided nature is not true, the main alternative is some sort of transcendence that explains nature and that makes the case that the Judeo-Christian, I'd even say the Greco-Roman tradition in its best form recognizes is that there are transcendent standards. And as a Christian, I would locate that in a transcendent personal God. But whether you do that or not, even if you say someone like a atheist but non-materialist, Thomas Nagel, who recognizes that Darwinism isn't what it's cut out, doesn't explain things, and materialism doesn't explain things. The alternative to that is a sense of transcendent standards that we are not the author of and that have claims on us. And a lot of people don't want to, it's too easy in their personal life to say, well, there aren't any of those outside standards that I am accountable to because it's all a myth. Darwin showed it. And if it was true that Darwin isn't true, then you have to ask, well, then what's the alternative? And then if it's true, well, maybe the best alternative is there's some sort of transcendent explanation. Then you mean these transcendent standards that humans have talked about, what C.S. Lewis talked about, the Tao, have been talked about for human civilizations for a long time. Maybe they're true. Maybe they have claims on me. Well, then maybe I shouldn't be living how I'm living. And so I think you're right that is a reason for some people.
Brian Bissell writes, what do you do when you meet people who deny that there is evidence for creation science and the atrocities that Darwinism has caused, both before and after they have read or watched substantive articles or seminars like this one, The Biology of the Second Reich, which you wrote,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you wrote that, Dr. Weichert's and Dr. West's research and others.
So I would say that the best thing in dealing with people who come from different viewpoints is always first to try to find common ground. As little common ground as may exist, you try to find that, and then you build that incrementally. And so the first thing may not be to go for the jugular. In fact, it rarely is. It's to get to know people, and also to get to know what really is animating them. Because in some cases, it may be not so intellectual at all. You know, intellect, I fully believe that intellect is important, ideas are important, but I also believe that people are motivated by lots of things. And until you really understand what's motivating someone and where their deepest hurts come from, you may have a hard time in addressing and building common ground. I think asking questions a lot to get them to justify what they believe. And then if they say things are just out and out not true or something, then you could pick selectively, well, have you read this? Because, or have you thought about what this atheist says, like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, but says that Darwinism doesn't really explain things. In other words, you can do things that begin to, rather than expecting to get them in a sitting where you get them from A to Z, get to know them, get them defending their views, asking them strategic questions to better understand where they're coming from, and then choose one thing where there might be some common ground, and then try to build on that.
And Brian did sort of follow up with this idea that, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, some people are just immune to facts, and you can point out the factual basis for the theory behind the biological theory behind the Second Reich. And that's supported through first-rate research, but they just refuse to accept it, that there's any connection between Darwin and what we saw with Second Reich racism or Third Reich racism.
Yeah, you probably may not want to start with the Third Reich because it's so, I mean, people, it's so emotional, they don't want to deal with it. Actually, the human zoos, it may be one to start with because it's so much more direct and because of all the concern with race things. But the best thing may not even be to start with those consequences. It's starting to, well, why do they think that there is, or do they really think, what explanation do they think? What explanation do they have of the universe? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one thing is, well, how do they think the universe started, or what do they think explains it? And if they just say, for example, the universe always existed, well, modern science doesn't believe that anymore. Now, there are debates on it, Steve Meyer goes into, but really, that is, really at the Big Bang, conceptually, that's the beginning of matter, energy. It's before that, so it requires a cause that is outside of matter and energy and time. And so get them to focus on something that is less intimidating to them. I do think you're right, especially those that are most hardcore. They don't want to hear the reality because it's so, I mean, think of it, if someone has believed in something that's not true, that goes to the core of their existence, and you're throwing ice water on that, there would, when you go in the swimming pool, you often, or out, so you sort of go in part way sometimes. Now, there's some people just jump in, they like the bracing thing, but many people want to go part way until they get used to it. And so I just say that that's a way to, when you're dealing with other people, try to find common ground.
Abby Guzman writes that Darwinism completely leaves out morality. This obviously bothered them, evidenced by the introduction of eugenics. I think it's interesting that the internal pull for morality is present, whether or not they responded to it. They attempted to justify their actions or beliefs. I believe this is the universal acknowledgement of a moral law.
Yeah, I think it's hard to, I mean, people can evade it. but I think it's hard to completely evade the moral law written on our hearts. And certainly Darwin himself, it's interesting. One of his strongest followers was Thomas T.H. Huxley. And on the issue of Darwinism and morality, they had a significant split. So Darwin tried to explain morality in Darwinian terms. That his theory would explain why we have moral beliefs, and this is just compatible with beliefs in morality. Thomas Huxley gave a famous lecture on basically Darwin and ethics, where he said, well, actually, you look at nature, you have the maternal instinct, you have infanticide, you have cruelty, you have all this stuff. How can you get, he disagreed with Darwin. And so he actually said, actually, morality in his view is often fighting against what you find in nature. Now, but he didn't have an explanation for it. He just sort of asserted that we have to act against nature, even though there was no basis that he could articulate for it. But I'll give him credit for actually acknowledging the problem, and so I do think that many people who have that belief are troubled at some level by, they don't want to abandon morality. In fact, the clearest teaching of that is that the very idea, when they object to, say, the idea of design in nature, they say that, well, God wouldn't have done it that way. Why is there pain? Why is there evil? Which is a whole nother topic. Why does it matter? What is evil? In a Darwinian terms of the universe, in a Darwinian mechanical view of the universe, who cares? I mean, what is evil? What is good? It's all part of reality. And so who are you to object? The very fact that they object and raise the problem of evil shows that there's some standard that they themselves are not willing to give up.
Yes.
So
I believe it was Alexander Pope who said, whatever is right.
Yeah.
Compatible with that idea. Margarita writes, why did Darwin claim that African people are the closest to apes and thus of the lowest value among humans? And why would ape-likeness make a group of humans less valuable anyway, if there is no difference between humans and animals?
Well, so you have different, those are great questions and highlight some of the internal contradictions. Why? Darwin would say there were gradations. And so for all of his talking about there is no fundamental difference, he then spent a lot of his time talking about higher and lower. And so he talked out of both sides of his mouth, and most Darwinists did that too. And then the later ones actually were just more explicit. And this was, they joined together with like a Hegelian view of the German philosopher Hegel of sort of evolving history, evolving civilizations, evolving races, and it was all fused together into the sort of this hierarchy that evolution was progressive, which so that was a Darwinian view. Now, why they chose Africans as being, in Darwin's view, it was blacks in Africa and also Australian Aborigines. So it was, I think they tried to make, Darwin himself had interactions with some native peoples on his journey that were kind of negative, and Darwin was influenced by the scientists of his time. So there were a lot of people who made connections that they tried to say that, well, look, their jaws look like ape jaws, or this, they made various pretexts. But this really, from the advent of Western colonialism and the Enlightenment, you had a lot of people arguing that Africans were closer to other animals, and Darwin was in that stream. I don't want to say that Darwin invented that. He didn't. It went back prior to him. But his argument that he had a scientific justification for it was what really continued to give it legs and claimed that it was science.
Doug Sable wonders if, do you think that Darwin possibly foresaw the impact that his theory would have on humanity? The man was no prophet. He wasn't even clairvoyant, but still a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. He died in the 19th century, so he didn't live that much, lived a couple decades or so after it. He did live to see, he really did found a movement, and he certainly did see other people applying it to other areas of life like eugenics during his lifetime, although not the full-throated. Much of the eugenics came later. but the beginnings of it was during his lifetime, and he actually wrote about things in The Descent of Man that related to it. But so I don't know. I certainly think by the end of his life, he saw how influential his theory was becoming culturally, but there were still a lot of debates, and whether he fully, I mean, I don't know. It's hard. Good question, but I don't know.
May we take 2 more questions?
Sure.
And then we'll have pretty much run our course time-wise. So Betsy Stewart writes that under Darwinism, there is no such thing as free will. In behavioral genetics, the research focuses on behavior as a result of genetics and environment. There's always a huge error term in the modeling, which I think is where free will comes in.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's without getting to the second part of it, because I'm not a scientist, I'm a social scientist, but it is certainly true that in Darwin's view, and he made this especially clear in his private notebooks, there wasn't much role for it. It was either hereditary or environment. There's nothing else. And so it was a very reductionist view. And this has been a typical problem for most thoroughgoing Darwinists. I'd say most scientists today, they just they live one way. Their science teaches them that, there is no free will, but they can't live that way. And they just don't try to reconcile the things.
Well, and unfortunately, for time's sake, let's just take one more question. There are several more that frankly are excellent, but I know we're actually a little bit over our expiration time right now. But this is a question from Brian Bissell. What can we do to make Christians aware that economic Darwinism on the political right, especially trickle-down economics, which is naked greed and strictly forbidden by the Bible as the root of all evil, 1 Timothy 6:10, and many other verses that show that it destroys lives on earth and for eternity. The love of money being the root of all evil is even more destructive than the terrible support for biological Darwinism on the left.
But that's a really interesting question, and I'll have to be really short on here. I'd encourage you to read my book, Darwin Day in America, which discusses this in depth. When I originally wrote that book, I had the view that modern economic conservatism was sort of social Darwinism writ large and had been influenced at the end of the 19th century by Darwinism, sort of survival of the fittest. It actually turns out, as a historical matter, that much of economic conservatism arguments, which well predated Darwin, actually owed very little to Darwinian ideology, and at least in the terms of how people defended it, were not just survival of the fittest, and they actually viewed economics as a transaction that both sides benefit from. And it was actually, you actually had people who were arguing for economic freedom in the 19th century who were explicitly arguing against Darwin, as Darwin was having a Malthusian view of life, that if one person succeeds, that can only be at the cost of someone else, rather than sort of a rising tide lifts all boats. And so I just, as a historical matter, the connection between Darwinism and economic conservatism, at least in philosophy and in public rhetoric and other things, is actually a lot more complicated than you might think. And I changed my view on that from when I actually immersed myself into it. Now, having said that, is there a type of secular economic conservatism that pretty much is dog eat dog? Yes. And is that anti-biblical? Yes. And is that, and do those conservatives, I mean, there are some, I'd say, some secular libertarians who today do elevate a Darwinian view, and they actually embrace what was viewed as an insult by most economic conservatives in the 19th century. You have some modern economic libertarians who are secular who actually embrace it. And I do write about that in my book. And I think the only way you you let people know is by writing about it and by talking about it so that people know about it. And I do think that this emphasis on materialism being of acquisition, there's philosophical materialism where, but then there is one of the things that comes from it is the idea that just things and material things is all that matters. And that certainly is anti-Christian, anti-Judaism, anti-Islam for that matter, anti any sort of spiritual view of humanity, and people should know about that. So,
And which book is it of yours that addresses that issue?
So I say in Darwin Day in America, the chapter on economics, it talks about the influence on left-wing economics, but then on Marxism, but then also the relation between that and economic conservatism. Which again, the actual impact of Darwinism on economic conservatism is a lot less than you might think. But there are some people today who I think have a very bad view of economic freedom, that it's primarily just about acquisition, how much I can acquisite for myself. And really, I would also say, if you want a better view of the economy from a free market perspective, I would encourage you to do the writings like the book Wealth and Poverty by my colleague George Gilder at Discovery Institute. He's not part of the Center for Science and Culture, but that was transformative to me as an undergraduate, because I actually took a course from an economic conservative who was all about money, and it made me so negative. And then I read George's book that really, in his view, at the heart of economic freedom, properly construed, what drives economic innovation in a free market system is not selfishness, it's actually giving and altruism. And not that you can have bad capitalists and bad people who don't do that, but that's dysfunctional. The problem is you have some conservatives who argue that selfishness is what drives economic progress. And that is, in a way, a very Darwinian view, a very Malthusian, very Darwinian view. But George's view, which I would tend to agree with more, is that what drives, insofar as economic freedom works, and it has dysfunctions, but insofar as it works, is what's really driving the progress is altruism, self-giving behavior of entrepreneurs and other things, not people trying to cheat people or just make an easy buck. There are people who are trying to do that, but that's dysfunctional. That's not why you get the good things that you do out of economic freedom.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And again, my apologies for those of you whose questions came a little bit later and we weren't able to get to them. But I do appreciate the fact, John, that you addressed directly and as succinctly as possible these issues and questions that came up, some of which did require a fairly lengthy response. So thank you very much in that respect. And thank you also for all the valuable work that you and your colleagues there at the Discovery Institute have done over the last 30 years. It's been so very valuable for so many of us.
Well, thank you for the great work that Areopagus is doing, and thank you for having me. It's been a really enjoyable afternoon for me, and I hope evening for most of you who are in the Georgia area. So
that's right. You're a little behind the times.
Yes, we are.
Out there on the left coast, as we call it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for your questions and input. And we will also have an Areopagus forum scheduled in May as well. We'll be back in touch as far as the speaker and the topic. So thank you. Blessings on your evening and the rest of your week.
Thank you all.